Thank you very much, Mr. President. And as you stated, this is Bill 44-20, Human Rights and Civil Liberties, Racial Equity and Social Justice Advisory Committee Members Amendment. This is a bill that I am the lead sponsor with every one of you co-sponsoring. We did have a public hearing on October 20th, 2020, and we had 4 speakers. We also held the Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee held a work session on November 18th. This bill would require the Office of Legislative Oversight to submit a racial equity and social justice impact statement for each zoning text amendment. The law already requires the Office of Legislative Oversight to submit an impact statement for bills. But inadvertently, we did not include zoning text amendments, and great work, I'll say it again, by Chief of Staff Valeria Carranza from Councilmember Glass's office, who noticed this, and we decided to come back and make sure that we would remedy that situation. Also, the bill adds 2 additional public members to the Racial Equity and Social Justice Advisory Committee and authorizes the executive to establish 1 or more task forces to study and make recommendations on specific racial equity and social justice issues. It is clear that we have extraordinarily diverse county with a lot of different particular issues that are impacted by racial equity and social justice. And it was brought up to our attention that the advisory committee, as it was constituted, lacked representation from particular groups, and recognizing that the executive is the one who gets to make appointments, we decided to introduce the bill to add more members to give the executive that flexibility, but also went a little further in including authorizing the executive to establish, for example, a limited task force if there are issues of import that need to be examine a bit deeper, and then they can come back and present to the advisory committee. And this way, there is flexibility to ensure that we are able to get as much input from the community as possible. Additionally, the committee at the work session approved some additional amendments. 1, requiring the Office of Legislative Oversight to consult with the planning board staff before submitting a racial equity and social justice impact statement for a ZTA. We had a lot of discussion around this. The planning board wanted to actually be the body that would submit the impact statements for ZTA, and we definitely recognize the value of such a proposition, but we decided that we wanted to keep things consistently and therefore continue to house this responsibility in the Office of Legislative Oversight, understanding that we probably will need to provide some capacity to the Office of Legislative Oversight and maybe even to the Planning Board, which is something that we can then discuss during budget. We also clarified that a ZTA without an impact statement is still valid. We delayed the effective date for the submission of an impact statement for a ZTA until September 1st, 2021, precisely because we recognized the need for additional capacity and understood that we should go through the budget process first. And if we indeed, the council decides, or hopefully the executive includes that capacity, it would take a little bit of time for those positions to be hired. We also require the equity action plan to require the executive to explain how each supplemental appropriation promotes racial equity and social justice, so that when we receive a supplemental, we need to make sure that there is a statement contained. Also requiring the council to establish a process for explaining how each special appropriation promotes racial equity and social justice. Remember, these are budgetary decisions, and that's part of the thrust of the legislation. We also require the limited issue task forces to report to the executive along with the county council and the advisory committee, and that's related to the first point. I also want to share that in addition to these particular amendments, there were 2 other issues that we discussed, and we agreed that we would want language to present to you today. Number 1, provide discrete data on disproportionality to the chief equity officer. This is an issue that came up regarding barriers that there was not enough disaggregated data available, and this was going to make it difficult for the chief equity officer, also even the Office of Legislative Oversight to do its work. So we decided to include this in the bill because we felt it was important to codify this as a critical component, again, a major tenet of this legislation. Number two, we agreed that we want to require the county executive to provide impact statements on MCPS's budget that is submitted through his annual budget request. Why? We know that we cannot require MCPS, because it's a state agency, to provide equity impact statements. But the truth of the matter is that when the executive transmits his budget request, the school board's budget is embedded in that request. And I actually did have a conversation with the superintendent about this, and he thought that this would be fine. It doesn't have to be something line item by line item, just generally, which they kind of do already, but generally be able to provide a statement that describes the macro sort of highlights of new initiatives, or if there are any kind of restructurings or things like that. How is this going to promote racial equity and social justice? And that way, when the executive transmits his request to us second week of March, that there be an inclusion of such a narrative describing how the MCPS's budget would help us achieve our goal, generally speaking. So those are two other items that are also the language. Basically is that after following, adding after line 14 on the first area, the first item was basically provide discrete data on disproportionality and other information to the office as needed. That's the language for that piece, for the data. And for the MCPS explanation of, broadly speaking, their budget, it would be to amend lines 9 to 13 to say, including the recommended operating and capital budgets for the County Board of Education, or in a supplemental appropriation. And this covers those two areas. So, of course, you have a committee recommendation, but I also want to move those additional items and that language for the body. So that way, hopefully, we have a robust and strengthened, in my opinion, legislation. I want to thank everyone who's worked on this, Dr. Elaine Bonner-Tompkins, Ms. Tiffany Ward, Mr. Drummer, also advocates in our very diverse Muslim community who came forward to request some additional flexibility with the advisory committee. And of course, my colleagues on the Government Operations and Fiscal Policy Committee, Councilmember Sidney Katz, as well as Councilmember Friedson, and Mr. Drummer for putting all of this together. So that is what I have before you.